Welcome back to Hardware Legends. In episode 5, we are going over the history of dual GPU graphics cards, as most people don't realize how many have actually been made. It is no surprise that dual GPU graphics cards exist. Many people have run or currently run multiple graphics cards in their computer, so the idea of having a single graphics card with two GPUs makes sense on paper. However, the reality has sometimes been very different, as we will discuss later on. So let's jump into it and go over every retail dual GPU graphics card from the 3DFX Voodoo 2 all the way to the Radeon Pro Duo. The 3DFX Voodoo 2, which launched in 1998, is quite the graphics card, featuring 3 chips, so technically it's not a dual GPU card, but yeah, let's carry on. It's also the first card to support SLI, allowing 2 cards to be run simultaneously, and draw the lines of the image in turn, allowing you to play Quake 2 at a staggering 1024 by 768 resolution. The Voodoo 2 is a legendary graphics card that needed to be mentioned, and many old school enthusiasts have fond memories about it, so much so that you can still find popular videos today about the Voodoo 2. It was an impressive graphics card for its time, and its legacy is still felt today by anyone running an SLI setup. Technically, the first dual GPU graphics card would go to the Ati Rage Fury Max, which was released in October of 1999 and featured 2 Rage 128 Pro GPUs built on the 250nm process in an alternate frame rendering configuration to allow an almost doubling of performance compared to the single GPU Rage Fury Pro. The Rage Fury Max was a powerful graphics card at the time, although its pricing was a little bit high, which meant it didn't sell quite as well compared to the popular GeForce 256, and compatibility issues with Windows meant that it only worked properly with Windows 98 and ME, which further limited its use. The 3DFX Voodoo 5 5500 came out in the year 2000 after some delays, and featured dual Napalm VSA 100 GPUs. It easily outperformed the Rage Fury Max and the GeForce 256, but this was short-lived as the GeForce 2 GTS and Radeon DDR both arrived and utterly destroyed the Voodoo 5 5500. The 5500 was also a big graphics card for its day, taking up quite a bit of space, which was a concern for gamers who are running smaller cases, and ultimately it was a failure which continued the decline of 3DFX, who ultimately were bought by Nvidia in 2002. Dual GPU graphics cards so far hadn't really proved themselves, so there was a break of about 4 years before we saw the next one. The first dual GPU Nvidia graphics card wasn't made by Nvidia, but weirdly enough Gigabyte, who slapped together 2 GeForce 6600 GT GPUs onto a single card and called it the Gigabyte 3D1. Released in 2004, the 3D1 was Gigabyte trying to appeal to consumers' allure for dual GPU graphics cards, instead of buying 2 separate graphics cards and using them in SLI, which had been growing in popularity more and more. The 3D1 was large, ran hot, and had compatibility issues with certain motherboards, but was cheaper than buying 2 6600 GTs separately, and had fantastic performance, although about on par with a single 6800 GT. But it started to generate interest back into dual GPU graphics cards, and Nvidia certainly noticed this. The GeForce 7800 Gt Joule was the first dual GPU launched by Nvidia, but technically the second dual GPU Nvidia card, which launched in 2005 featuring twin 110nm G70 Curie GPUs, and was an absolute beast of a graphics card in terms of performance and size. The only downsides to the 7800 Gt Joule was the fact that it cost more than 2 7800 GTs bought separately, and the fact that dual GPU graphics cards still required large PCBs, which meant they were often too big for some gamers to fit inside their cases. Nvidia thought about this and decided the best solution was to have 2 PCBs instead of 1, releasing the 7950 GX2 in 2006, which I guess is difficult to define as it really isn't a dual GPU graphics card, but it isn't really two graphics cards either. The 7950 GX2 features two G71 GPUs and are connected via an SLI bridge. It offered higher clock speeds and double the memory compared to two 7900 GTs and SLI, while costing about the same and taking up less room, so it certainly had an appeal. Performance was fantastic, and the card was relatively quiet despite what you might think, and although some motherboards had compatibility issues, it was overall a very unique and interesting graphics card, which you can still find videos about today. You might have noticed a lack of dual GPU Radeon graphics cards, as they were taking a bit of a break from them. However, G-Cube decided to make their own one with the Radeon X16 Gt Joule, also known as the Gemini 2, which launched in 2006 and featured two RV560 GPUs. The Gemini 2 was the first dual GPU graphics card to use crossfire, or in this case, self-crossfire, which meant that it tricked the software into thinking it was two separate graphics cards, which helped alleviate some of the compatibility issues that had plagued previous generations of dual GPU cards. However, the Gemini 2 was a loud graphics card, although not as bad as certain other Radeon graphics cards that come to mind, but it did manage to squeeze everything into a single slot design, which was impressive, but this came at a cost as the Gemini 2 was expensive and many gamers overlooked it. This was corrected with the release of the Radeon 3870X2 in 2008, featuring dual R680 GPUs, which made it the first graphics card to achieve more than 1 teraflop of processing power. But it is a long graphics card, coming in at 10.5 inches, which meant size concerns for certain users. The 3870X2 had a 12-layer PCB compared to the 8-layer design of the standard 3870, and it also had higher GPU clock speeds, but slower GDDR3 memory to help keep costs down. This resulted in the 3870X2 being cheaper than two 3870s bought separately, while performance was at the top of the charts, taking the performance crown away from Nvidia, with the 3870X2 being described as the most elegant single-card multi-GPU design we've seen to date by AnandTech. The compatibility issues that were a big drawback for previous dual GPU graphics cards were not an issue with the 3870X2, which also made consumers feel more confident in buying them, resulting in the cheaper 3850X2 being released a few months later for those looking for something a little bit cheaper. Nvidia didn't just sit around though and released the GeForce 6800 GX2 soon after the 3870X2, featuring twin 65nm G92 GPUs and a huge price tag of $600 at launch in 2008. This was also another large card, coming in at 10.5 inches long. The 9800 GX2 looks absolutely awesome, but more importantly, it had fantastic performance and easily won back the performance crown for Nvidia from ATI. But the high price tag meant that only hardcore enthusiasts were willing to buy them. After the success of the 3870X2, it won't surprise you that ATI went for another dual GPU card in the 4000 series with the 4870X2, which paired two R700 GPUs onto a single graphics card, taking process power up to 2.4 teraflops, which was a serious number back then. The 4870X2 didn't muck around and was extremely powerful, but came at a high price of $550. High power consumption and high temperature production meant that, like previous dual GPU cards, only some people could afford to run them or wanted to run them. At this stage, with the power that the 4870X2 was showing, it seemed like the industry was trending towards dual GPU graphics cards for the very high-end Radeon and GeForce cards. But the question was, how long would this last? The Nvidia Geforce Gtx 295 almost doesn't need an introduction, but for those unfamiliar with it, I'll tell you a bit about it. It launched at the start of 2009, aiming to take on the 4870X2, and it did that for sure. It featured two GT200B GPUs from the GTX 280. However, these were running at lower clock speeds, and the 295 also had lower memory speeds compared to the 280. This was done to reduce temperatures and power consumption. The 295 was very powerful, beating the 4870 X2 while also being better value for money. Although the card was popular among enthusiasts, it put Nvidia off making dual GPUs for a while, only to eventually bring them back 2 years later with the GTX 590, which we'll talk about soon. AMD countered the GTX 295 with the Radeon HD 5970, which took the performance crown back once again to Team Red, but this also came with a huge price tag of $600 at launch in 2009. The HD 5970 is also 12 inches long, just like my Subway sandwich I ate the other day, so you had to make sure it would fit first. And AMD recommended a huge 750 watt power supply to use with the 5970 and its high 295 watt TDP. Once again, the 5970 had lower clock speeds than the single GPU 5870 as they needed to keep the TDP under 300 watts. However, this didn't stop overclockers having a field day with them, which did give them a decent performance boost. The 5970 was a powerful graphics card, but it also was very expensive and consumed lots of power, but it did beat the GTX 295 that was $100 cheaper by enough of a margin to warrant spending the extra money, but still, at $600 US, the 5970 was a very expensive graphics card for most people. Next up, we have a fascinating one, the Evga Gtx 460 2-Win, or Twin, however you want to pronounce it, which launched in March of 2011, which for those who remember back would know that the GTX 580 had already been launched in November of 2010, so why on earth did Evga release a dual GPU 460 months after the 580 launched? I can't answer why they launched it, but I can tell you what it featured, which was two GTX 460 GF104 Fermi GPUs with a combined total of 672 CUDA cores compared to the 512 of the GTX 580. And it did beat the 580 in games, coming in at a lower price point too, of $420 US compared to the $499 of the GTX 580. However, like always, you had the compatibility issues and micro stuttering issues associated with a dual GPU card, which were not present with the 580. So it kind of made some people a bit uneasy about buying them. They're also kind of rare, so not many people actually own them. Let's head back over to Team Red and talk about the Radeon 6990, which also hit shelves in March of 2011. This is a card that I would imagine many of you are familiar with, or you must have at least heard of it. The 6990 featured two Antilles XT GPUs with 3072 stream processors in total, which gave it a huge amount of power, but that power came at a cost of a staggering 375 watt TDP and a price tag of $700 US, which was $200 more than the GTX 580. This did win the performance crown back for AMD, but only for a short time, as Nvidia was already preparing to launch the GTX 590 in response, which launched at the end of March and ended AMD's claim to the overall performance crown. However, these two graphics cards were so expensive that very few people could justify paying that much money for them, so once again, not that many people actually owned them. Speaking of the GTX 590, let's go over that. So as you might have guessed, it features two GF110 GTX 580 GPUs with a total of 1024 CUDA cores and an enormous 365 watt TDP, even though the 590 had lower core and memory clock speeds compared to a single GTX 580. The 590 also came in at $700 US, so the price matched the 6990, and they also matched each other in performance, going blow for blow. Depending on which game you were playing, maybe the 6990 was better or maybe the 590 was better. Overall though, generally the 590 was slightly better in terms of performance, so the performance crown had to be given over to Nvidia, but it was very, very close. I also have to mention that fan noise was starting to become an issue as dual GPU cards used a lot of power and generated a lot of heat, which often meant that they had very aggressive fan curves to compensate for that, leading to high amounts of fan noise. The Asus Mars 2 Dual GTX 580 also needs to be mentioned here. This was essentially a 590 that didn't have the reduced clock speeds, which improved performance, but it also came in at a whopping $1,500 US, so pretty much nobody could afford it. I mean, you could buy two 590s or 6990s for less. So for those looking for a cheaper dual GPU solution, EVGA released the GTX 560 Ti to win in November of 2011. Just like the 460 to win, this was a dual GPU version of the 560 Ti featuring two GF114 GPUs, bringing the total CUDA core count to 768 compared to the 512 of the GTX 580. It had better performance than the GTX 580 as well, and was only slightly more expensive at $520 compared to the $500 of the 580, so it was a compelling card for many people, but it did have less effective memory than the 580 and produced more noise, so it did have its downsides alongside the usual downsides with dual GPU graphics cards. 2011 was just a crazy year for dual GPU graphics cards. More came out in 2011 than any other year. But let's jump to 2012 and the Nvidia GTX 690. And this is a card that I remember well, but I never actually ran it because it cost $1,000 US. The 690 ran two GK104 Kepler GPUs from the 680. With reduced clock speeds to help keep the TDP to 300 watts, but memory clock speeds remained unchanged, resulting in an extremely powerful GPU that could easily beat two 7970s in Crossfire. But with only 2 GB of effective memory, it wasn't really that ideal. The astronomical price once again meant that the 690 was only for the ultra enthusiasts, but it did gain a small following as a powerful graphics card that looked really good. EVGA also made the GTX 680 to win, which was essentially the same thing, but with the same clock speeds as a standard 680, and it was thicker than Steve from Hardware Unboxed after a seafood buffet. The following year, AMD released the HD 7970. Now this is definitely a card that you should all be familiar with, as it created a big splash in the industry and it looked absolutely phenomenal. The 7990 featured two Tahiti GPUs from the very popular 7970, having a huge total of 4096 stream processors and a solid amount of 3 GB of GDDR5 effective memory, which was more than enough for back then. Core clock speeds were also decent and were actually higher than the reference 7970s, but a little bit lower than the 7970 GHz edition cards. Performance-wise, the 7990 was almost perfectly tied with the 690. It really depended on the game as to which one would come out on top. They're also exactly the same price, coming in at $1,000 US. But the 7990 did have a higher TDP at 375 watts compared to the 300 watt TDP of the 690. The 7990 was also a little bit late to the market though, and Asus had already launched the Aries 2, which was basically two 7970 GHz edition cards put together, and came with liquid cooling, but it also came with a $1,400 US price tag, which was $400 more expensive than the 7990, so it was nowhere near as popular. By this point, it must be said, the lust for dual GPU graphics cards had started to disappear, as more and more powerful single card solutions became available, and higher and higher pricing meant that enthusiasts were opting for powerful single card solutions rather than paying so much money for complicated dual GPU cards. However, this didn't stop AMD from launching the Radeon R9 295X2 in April of 2014, featuring two Hawaii XT GPUs from the 290X, giving it a total of 5,632 stream processors and 4 GB of effective memory on a huge 512-bit bus, with clock speeds being slightly higher than a reference 290X. The 295X2 came with an eye-watering TDP of 500 watts. I'm not kidding. Which meant that AMD was forced to sell it with an all-in-one liquid cooler attached, which did help keep the temps and noise down, but also meant that the 295X2 came in at a huge $1,500 at launch, which was massive considering a single 290X cost $550. The crazy performance of the 295X2 meant that it could beat two 780 Ti's in SLI, while its lower heat and noise meant that enthusiasts were happy that they didn't have a hairdryer in their rig. But the power usage was high, and so was the price. So while it was very interesting and a very good looking graphics card, it was just far too expensive for the vast majority of consumers. However, Nvidia would make it look cheap with the launch of the Titan Z. Arriving about a month after the 295X2, the Titan Z was an absolutely insane card featuring two GK100B Titan GPUs for a total of 5,760 CUDA cores and had 6 GB of GDDR5 effective memory, all for the low price of $3,000, which made it double the price of the already expensive 295X2. The Titan Z is a card that I still don't understand. Unlike the 295X2, which cost a fortune but gave you much better cooling and lower noise than running two 290Xs in Crossfire, the Titan Z was hot and had low core clock speeds coming in at 705 MHz on the base clock, which meant that two 780 Ti's often had higher performance for less than half the cost. The Titan Z did have double the memory at 6 GB versus 3 GB for the 780 Ti's, but that was not enough to justify such a high price tag, and considering the 295X2 had 4 GB, most consumers would go for that instead if they were worried about memory usage. The Titan Z was a decent productivity card for certain compute applications, but for gamers and enthusiasts it really fell flat, and I didn't know anybody who owned one. Finally, we have the last and only dual GPU graphics card that I've ever reviewed on Tech Showdown, the Radeon Pro Duo, which featured two R9 Nano GPUs for a total of 8,192 stream processors and had 4 GB of HBM memory, coming in at $1,500 in mid-2016. It launched only a month before the GTX 1080 came out, and as I showed in both my GTX 980 SLI vs Pro Duo video and the GTX 1080 vs Pro Duo video, it really couldn't compete against Nvidia, even though it had two GPUs, especially when price was taken into consideration. Many people were upset with me, claiming it was a productivity card, but AMD did market it for both gaming and productivity, which is essentially what they also did with the Radeon 7. But the Pro Duo failed to impress me, and since then we haven't seen any more dual GPU graphics cards from AMD or Nvidia. Now why is that? Well, I'll give you 3 main reasons in my opinion. First is compatibility issues. Many dual GPU cards, especially in the early days, had tremendous compatibility issues, not only with Windows but with lots of games, which may have only been able to use a single GPU, letting the second GPU just sit idle like a lazy person in the group project. Obviously, this is going to be incredibly frustrating to deal with, so it scared off newer users who might have been afraid of running into these issues. While even the enthusiasts would often complain about not being able to fully use their dual GPU card in certain titles. This did get better over time, but it's an issue that never fully went away, and it's always been a struggle with dual GPU graphics cards or just running multiple graphics cards in general. Micro stuttering is another issue that anybody that ever ran a dual GPU graphics card would have noticed at some point or another. This is caused by synchronization issues between the two GPUs, resulting in short stutters in the game due to inconsistent frame times. This is very game dependent, but can drive you absolutely crazy if the game is poorly optimized for multi-GPU setups and absolutely ruin the experience even if your FPS numbers are still very high. However, more and more games became optimized for multiple GPUs, which did tend to eliminate this issue, but it's still something that people worry about, and it is still an issue to this day. Lastly, we have cost. As you may have noticed, and certainly towards the end of the list we just covered, dual GPU graphics cards are often very expensive because they have twice as many components as their single GPU brothers, while often requiring much larger coolers in order to keep temperatures down, which further adds to the cost. Dual GPU cards do often have the benefit of taking up less room than running two separate cards in Crossfire or SLI. But if that comes at a much higher price, it can be hard for consumers to justify paying for a dual GPU card when they could just buy two separate cards for less, which may have the same or even higher performance than the dual GPU solution. I think this is the biggest factor as to why we haven't seen and most likely won't see any dual GPU cards for a while. But I would like to throw it to you guys. What do you think about dual GPU cards, and do you think we'll see them again in the future? I thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it, as it was very difficult for me to make and took a very long time. I'm very proud with how it came out, and I thank you all so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to Tech Showdown if you want to show support for the channel, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.